Today's story is so intense, so deeply human. It will leave you questioning what justice really means in the brutal world of the Wild West. A place of cracked earth, dying towns, and men who learned the hard way that survival often demands a price. It begins in a stretch of desert where help never comes and mistakes are paid for in blood. All because of one small act of violence, something easily forgotten by those who caused it, but impossible to forget for the man who witnessed it. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Too worn to run, Gideon Crow stood in the open heat, his coat sun-bleached to the color of dust, boots split at the seams, his revolver hanging low like a habit he never quite abandoned. At his side waited Ironhoof, gray and corded with muscle, eyes slow and patient, ribs faint beneath weathered hide. An animal shaped by too many trails and too many summers that refused to finish him. The bandits mistook stillness for weakness. They always did. "Much obliged," Varric Blackridge said as he took the gold, the coins chiming softly in his palm. "Didn't peg you for trouble, old man." "I'm not trouble," Gideon answered. His hand rested on Ironhoof's neck, firm, steady, protective. "That's why I asked," Blackridge replied with a grin. The riders turned away, already laughing about how long an old man and a worn-out horse would last without water. Then it happened. Just before spurring his mount, Cade Rusk lifted his whip and slashed it hard across Ironhoof's flank. The sound cracked, sharp and cruel. Ironhoof cried out, short, broken. The desert fell silent. Gideon didn't reach for his gun. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He only watched as the riders vanished into the dust. "Gold can be earned again," he said quietly to no one. "But that horse, that's the last thing I ever swore to keep safe." Far ahead, the man who took his gold never realized something far more dangerous than anger had just been set loose. By the time Ironhoof's cry faded, the riders were gone. Dust drifted back to earth as if the land itself were holding its breath. Gideon stood where they left him, one hand pressed against Ironhoof's warm, trembling neck. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy." Ironhoof favored his left hind leg now. The whip had broken skin. Not deep enough to ruin him, but enough to remind them both how close the line had been. Gideon tore cloth from his sleeve and wrapped the wound carefully, fingers steady despite the heat burning behind his eyes. He scanned the horizon. Empty. No one rides back out here out of mercy. The gold was gone, a heavy pouch of coins earned the hard way. 3 months tracking a killer who thought the desert washed sins clean. Harlan Voss's reward. Blood money, some would say. Gideon never argued. Gold was gold. Horses were kin. "They warned you," he said softly to Ironhoof. "Said we'd die out here." Ironhoof snorted, more offended than afraid. Gideon allowed a faint smile. "They don't know you." They rested until the sun dropped low enough to loosen its grip. Water was shared sparingly. When Ironhoof steadied, Gideon mounted slowly, favoring the knee that never healed right after Fort Griffin. He turned Ironhoof toward the tracks the riders had left behind. Not for the gold, not for the law, but because one of them had laughed while raising that whip. 4 riders, heavy horses, easy pace. They weren't worried about being followed. They should have been. No sensible man chased 4 armed outlaws into open desert. Gideon Crow rode on anyway. As night crept in, he reached into his coat and touched the folded paper he hadn't shown them. The wanted notice, creased and stained dark with old blood. The name printed there wasn't famous yet. By morning, it would be. And somewhere ahead, 4 men who believed they'd spared an old fool were about to remember why Texas once learned to fear men who valued their horses more than gold. The desert cooled fast after sunset. What the sun burned for hours, the night reclaimed in minutes. Gideon rode low in the saddle. Ironhoof's hooves kept a slow, uneven rhythm against the packed earth. The tracks were fresh, no effort to hide them. They rode like men who thought nothing behind them mattered anymore. Ironhoof's ears flicked, alert despite the pain. Gideon felt every hitch of his stride through the saddle. Anger tightened in his chest, but his breathing stayed slow. Rage got men killed. Memory kept them alive. They stopped near a dry arroyo just before full dark. Gideon dismounted carefully and checked the wound again. Swollen now, angry. Ironhoof leaned into him, calm, trusting. "I know," Gideon whispered. "I won't push you. Not yet." He built a small fire low in the bank, hidden from distance. While Ironhoof drank, Gideon chewed dried meat and listened as the desert settled around them. Far off, coyotes called into the dark. Wind slid through the scrub in low whispers. Gideon Crow remembered another night, years back. Another fire, another horse, the same vow carried through time. They had been surrounded then as well. Men yelling, rifles leveled, one officer screaming for him to abandon the horse and save his own life. Gideon hadn't moved. That choice had branded him. A name earned the hard way, one that still opened doors in a few towns and shut mouths in others. Near midnight, laughter drifted across the sand. Gideon smothered the fire with a sweep of sand and led Ironhoof behind the bank. He crept forward inch by inch until a second campfire came into view, glowing faintly half a mile out. 4 shapes moved around it. Horses stood loose. A pouch changed hands, coins ringing softly. One man lifted his cup and laughed. "That old bastard should have thanked us. We spared him a slow death." Another man snapped his whip in the firelight, playful, careless. Gideon's jaw set. He counted again, measured the distance. Timed Ironhoof's breathing behind him. He could turn away. Let them ride off with the gold and vanish into the waste. Then the whip cracked again. For no reason at all. Gideon's hand slid toward his revolver. And for the first time since the strike, Ironhoof stamped the ground, sharp, furious. The horse had chosen. The night carried the sound. The hoofbeat wasn't loud, but in the still desert, it echoed like a gunshot. One of the men by the fire froze. "You hear that?" Gideon didn't move. He didn't scold the horse. Ironhoof hadn't erred. Fear traveled farther than silence out here. The closest man stood, peering into the dark. "Probably coyotes." "Coyotes don't sound like that," another muttered. Gideon eased back behind the bank, slow and deliberate, keeping Ironhoof's head low. The horse breathed hard through flared nostrils, muscles drawn tight beneath the saddle. Wounded or not, Ironhoof was ready. Gideon pressed his forehead briefly to the horse's neck. "Not yet," he whispered. Soon, time dragged. The men returned to their gold and drink, but their laughter thinned, frayed by unease. Unwelcome quiet crept in. When the fire burned low, Gideon circled wide, staying downwind. He wasn't here to rush them. He wasn't here to spill blood yet. He wanted faces, voices, names. At first light, the 4 men mounted up and rode east toward a stretch locals called Devil's Throat. Narrow paths, broken stone, no escape once you rode in. Gideon followed at a distance. As the sun climbed, Ironhoof slowed again. The limp deepened. Gideon felt it immediately and cursed under his breath. Not allowed. Never allowed. Near noon, the riders stopped at a shallow basin to water their horses. One man dismounted and slapped a horse that looked like Ironhoof, laughing. "Can't believe we didn't take that old wreck. Should have put it down. Mercy kill," Gideon's vision tightened. He dismounted slowly and tied Ironhoof in the shade of a rock outcrop. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his coat and drew out the folded wanted notice. The bounty wasn't for one man. It was for all four, dead or alive. And now they were tired, spread thin, thirsty. Gideon stepped into the sun, hands visible, walking straight toward the basin. The first shot would come soon, one way or another. The first man saw him as Gideon cleared the rocks. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Look who crawled back." The others turned. Hands drifted toward guns. 4 of them, 1 of him, just the way they liked it. Gideon stopped 20 paces out, palms open. The sun beat down on his hat, leaving his face in shadow. "I told you to take the gold," he said calmly. "I didn't tell you to stay." Varric Blackridge laughed. "You followed us for that horse?" He shook his head. "That thing's halfway dead already." Behind them, Ironhoof shifted and snorted, sensing the tension from afar. One man spat. "Old man's got a death wish." "Or he's stupid," another added. "Which is it?" someone asked. Gideon's eyes never left Cade Rusk, the same man who had laughed when he swung the whip. Rusk noticed and grinned, lifting the whip slowly. "You want this?" he taunted. "Come take it." That was when Gideon spoke again, quiet, level. "You've got 30 seconds to leave this basin." He let it sit. "Leave the horses, leave the gold. Walk." The laughter died. Varric Blackridge studied him now. Truly studied him. The uneven stance, the scar carved along Gideon Crow's jaw, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed but ready, shaped by long use. "And if we don't?" Blackridge asked. Gideon reached into his coat, not for his revolver, but for a folded sheet of paper. He flicked it into the dust between them. Blackridge swung down from his saddle and picked it up. The grin slipped from his face as he read. "Dead or alive," he murmured. Then his eyes lifted, sharp with recognition. "You're him." Cade Rusk scoffed. "So what? He's old and there's 4 of us." Gideon dipped his head once. "That's true." His eyes came up again, steady as stone. "But only one of you laid a hand on my horse." The whip snapped through the air. Gideon's revolver cleared leather before the sound finished traveling. The whip never completed its arc. One clean shot split the basin, flat and final. Rusk screamed as the bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. The silence shattered. 2 men fired at once. Rounds kicked dust at Gideon's boots as he dropped behind a low rise, breathing slow, mind stripped of everything but purpose. He answered with measured fire. One man went down, clutching his leg, screaming. Bram Holt cursed and hauled the wounded man toward cover. "Take his horse," Holt shouted. "Use it." That was the mistake. Gideon rose just enough to see Ironhoof rear against the rope, eyes wild, pain flaring through him. The sight tore something loose inside Gideon, something older than restraint. He moved fast now, ignoring the fire in his knee as he closed the distance. Another shot rang out. Corin Vale folded where he stood, hit square in the chest, breath leaving him in a wet gasp. Holt lunged for Ironhoof's reins, yanking hard, shoving a gun against the horse's neck. Ironhoof trembled, but he didn't bolt, didn't panic. He trusted. "Drop it!" Blackridge shouted. Gideon stopped 10 paces away. "You won't," he said. Blackridge's hand shook. Sweat cut clean lines through the dust on his face. "I will." "No," Gideon said, "because if you do, you die screaming." Blackridge saw it then. Not madness, not bluff. Certainty. Behind them, The wounded man dragged himself toward his gun. Ironhoof stamped once, hard. Gideon fired without looking. The basin fell quiet, broken only by Ironhoof's breathing and the wind sliding through dry grass. Blackridge lowered his weapon slowly. Gideon stepped closer, close enough for the truth to land. "This ends now," he said. "One way or the other." The gun slipped from Blackridge's fingers and hit the dirt. He raised both hands, eyes locked on Gideon. "Easy?" he said. "No need for more graves." Gideon didn't lower his revolver. He stepped past him and untied Ironhoof himself, hands gentle, voice low. "You did this," he said, not accusing, just stating fact. "All of you. But only one of you enjoyed it." He finished loosening the rope and rested his forehead against Ironhoof's neck. Ironhoof let out a long, shaking breath. Alive. Still trusting. When Gideon turned back, Blackridge was already edging away. "Take the gold," he said quickly. "All of it. Leave us the horses. We'll walk." Gideon shook his head once. "You're walking either way." He picked up the fallen pouch. The coins inside were darkened with another man's blood. "This gold was never mine," Gideon said. "It belongs to a family that won't sleep tonight knowing the man who killed their boy is still breathing." Blackridge swallowed. "You were law then?" "I was," Gideon said. "Once." He looked at the wounded men on the ground, one moaning, the other staring blankly at the sky. "I gave you a warning. I gave you a choice. You chose wrong." Blackridge clenched his jaw. "So what happens now?" Gideon holstered his revolver. "Now you live long enough to remember this." He turned away, leading Ironhoof back toward the rocks. Every step burned, every breath cut. He didn't slow. Behind him, Blackridge shouted, voice breaking, "You think this makes you better?" Gideon didn't turn. "No," he said. "It makes me finished." The desert swallowed the basin as Gideon Crow walked on, Ironhoof beside him, slow, wounded, alive. And somewhere behind them, the last man standing understood that the old stories about Texas weren't warnings. They were records. The walk back through the desert was slower than the chase. Ironhoof favored his leg more with each mile, and Gideon Crow adjusted his pace without a thought. Pain was something you listened to, not something you argued with. They reached a shallow ravine before dusk. Gideon set camp there, tucked out of the wind, every movement careful and deliberate. He cleaned Ironhoof's wound again, hands sure from long practice, voice even. "You held," he murmured. "Just like always." Ironhoof flicked an ear, breathing steady. When the fire sank low and the desert finally settled, Gideon allowed himself to sit. He stared into the coals, the weight of what had passed pressing down. Not regret, but recognition. Another horse came to mind. Another warning ignored. Another night when he'd chosen the law over what mattered. That choice had cost him everything once. He would not repeat it. At dawn, they rode west toward town. Slow, open, no attempt at hiding. When they crested the final rise, people were already gathered. Word traveled fast when men failed to return. Harlan Voss stood near the hitching rail, eyes narrowing as he took in the blood on Gideon's coat and the bandage along Ironhoof's flank. "They dead?" the sheriff asked quietly. "One will remember," Gideon replied. Voss let out a breath. "And the gold?" Gideon tossed him the pouch. "Belongs to Elin Mar, outside Red Mesa." Voss nodded once. "I'll see it returned." He paused. "You're not going to say it, are you?" Gideon shook his head. "No." The sheriff looked at Ironhoof, really looked, then stepped aside. That night, while the town slept, Gideon brushed his horse beneath the lantern's glow. Each stroke was slow, careful, final. By morning, Ironhoof walked without favoring the leg, and Gideon knew something else had mended as well. Peace never lingered long in places like this. At sunrise, a rider came hard from the east, alone, desperate, carrying a message meant for one man. Gideon recognized the horse before he saw the rider's face. The rider hauled up fast, dust rolling past the hitching rail. The horse was lathered, spent, army stock, government issue. That alone drew eyes. Gideon straightened slowly, one hand still resting on Ironhoof's neck. The rider dismounted stiffly and removed his hat. He was young, too young for the lines already carved into his face. "They said I'd find you here," he said. Gideon studied him. "Who sent you?" The rider swallowed. "Marshal Keir Rowan out of El Paso. Word spreading about the basin, about the gold." Voss stepped closer. "Spreading how?" The rider hesitated, then met Gideon's eyes. "They're calling it revenge, not justice." The words hit harder than lead. Gideon didn't argue, didn't explain. He'd learned long ago that truth didn't always need a witness. "There's more," the rider added. "The man you let walk, he didn't head west." Gideon's jaw tightened, barely. "He rode south," the rider continued. "Straight to the border camps. Told them you were hurt, said your horse was half dead, told them where you'd be tonight." The town fell quiet. "How many?" Voss asked. "8, the rider said. "Maybe more." "They want the gold," he added, "and they want the man who shamed them." Gideon looked down at Ironhoof, steady eyes, healed flank, trust unbroken. "They won't get either." The rider frowned. "You could leave, head north. They'd never catch you." Gideon shook his head once. "I won't run." "Why?" the rider asked. Gideon met his gaze. "Because my horse can't." Voss sighed, already knowing. "They'll come through the canyon at sundown." Gideon nodded. "Then we don't wait for them to reach town." He reached for his coat, fingers brushing the old scar beneath the cloth. For the first time since the whip cracked in the desert, Gideon Crow wasn't preparing to follow. He was preparing to stand. The canyon lay a mile east, a narrow throat of stone where sound traveled farther than sight. Gideon reached it before noon, Ironhoof moving steady but cautious. He dismounted well short of the choke point and led the horse behind a ridge where scrub and shadow hid them. "This is where we stop," he said softly. Ironhoof lowered his head, breathing calm. He trusted the voice more than the ground beneath his hooves. Gideon checked his revolver. 6 rounds. Then the rifle, slower to work, truer at distance. He laid everything out with care. Deliberate, methodical. No rush. Haste was for men who believed time belonged to them. Gideon Crow studied the canyon floor, the loose gravel, the sheer walls, the single clean corridor that led straight through. There was only one way in. They would have to take it. His thoughts drifted back to the reward notice. To the man he'd hunted for 3 months. To the widow who had cried without sound when it was finally over. That gold was meant to close a book. Instead, it had torn open another page. By mid-afternoon, Ironhoof shifted, ears angling east. Gideon felt it at the same moment. Not a noise, but a pressure in the air. Intention. He tied the reins low and rubbed the horse's neck once more. "Stay," he said quietly, "no matter what." Ironhoof snorted, unhappy, but did not resist. The sun slid lower when the first rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. then another, then more. 8 dark shapes cut against the light, moving slow, deliberate. They'd learned something. Gideon took position above them, rifle braced against stone, breath synced to his pulse. He waited until they were far enough in that turning back would cost them pride. Then he spoke. "You should have listened." His voice carried, calm and steady, bouncing off the rock. "Last chance." The riders froze. One of them let out a short, uneasy laugh. Old man still breathing. Gideon squeezed the trigger. The canyon answered. The first shot lifted the lead rider clean from the saddle. He never reached the ground alive. His horse screamed, slammed into the canyon wall, and bolted. Everything broke loose. Gunfire cracked and echoed, the sound folding in on itself, scrambling direction. Rounds sparked against stone where Gideon had stood seconds earlier. He rolled, pain ripping through his knee, breath punched from his lungs. But the rifle was already back up. Second shot. A rider twisted sideways, struck high in the chest. The third round went wide, too fast, too eager. Gideon corrected, slowed his breathing, waited. A bullet tore through his coat, burning his side. Pain flared sharp and honest. He grunted but kept moving. Below, the riders scattered, some dismounting, some forcing forward, trapped between rock and fear. One of them shouted, "Get the horse! That's what he cares about!" Gideon's head snapped toward the ridge. Ironhoof stood where he'd left him, ears pinned, eyes wide. Gideon shifted position, dragging himself behind a boulder, revolver in hand now. The rifle was too slow at this range. One of the men scrambled up the rocks, bleeding, desperate. Gideon fired once. The man toppled backward into the canyon, taking another with him. Smoke hung thick in the air. Powder stung Gideon's nose. Blood soaked his shirt. Dust clung to sweat. His vision narrowed. He pressed a hand to his side, warm, painful, not fatal, not yet. He counted again. 3 down, 1 badly wounded, 4 still moving. Then he heard it. Hooves. Fast. The sound he'd been dreading. Someone had broken through, and they were heading straight for Ironhoof. Gideon forced himself upright, pain tearing through his side like fire. He didn't look back at the canyon. He ran. Each step was a bargain struck with age, injury, and sheer refusal to quit. The world collapsed into 2 things: the thunder of hooves and the sight of Ironhoof tied behind the ridge, alone. The rider burst into view, riding hard, eyes locked on the horse. He raised his gun, not to fire, but to sever the rope. "No," Gideon said. Not shouted, said. He lifted the revolver with both hands, steadying the tremor. The sight wavered. He slowed his breath, remembered every lesson learned the hard way. The shot took the rider square in the back. The man pitched forward, dead before he hit the ground. Gideon reached Ironhoof a heartbeat later, cutting the rope with blood-slick hands. Ironhoof turned and pressed his head into Gideon's chest, ignoring the smell of powder and pain. "I've got you," Gideon whispered. "I've got you." Gunfire echoed again, closer now. The last men were climbing fast, desperation burning away caution. Gideon hauled himself into the saddle, teeth clenched as his side screamed. Ironhoof moved without command, slipping into a narrow trail only a horse trained by fear and trust would take. They came out behind the riders, unseen. Gideon fired twice from the saddle. One man dropped. The other turned too late. Silence settled again, broken only by Ironhoof's breathing and Gideon's. Strength drained from him all at once. Blood soaked the saddle. But the canyon lay empty. It was finished. Gideon leaned forward, resting his forehead against Ironhoof's neck. Breath ragged, alive. "Easy," Gideon Crow whispered again. Easy. Then his strength slipped. The world tilted, and he felt himself going down. The ground struck hard. It registered at a distance, as if it belonged to someone else. Dust filled his mouth. Above him, the sky washed out. Too bright, too wide. Ironhoof did not bolt. The horse circled once, then stepped in close, lowering himself beside Gideon, close enough to cast shade, close enough to be felt. Warm breath, solid weight, a presence that refused to leave. Gideon tried to move. His body answered with nothing. Blood darkened the dirt beneath him, spreading slow and heavy. He pressed a hand to his side again, weaker now. The pain dulled, and that frightened him more than the pain ever had. A faint smile touched his mouth. "Still here," he murmured. Voices drifted through the haze, far off at first, then nearer. Harlan Voss appeared above him, face tight, eyes sharp. "Don't you die on me," the sheriff said, already tearing cloth, already working. "You hear me?" Gideon looked past him, eyes fixed on Ironhoof. "He all right?" Voss followed his gaze and nodded. "Didn't take a scratch." "That's good." They lifted Gideon onto a wagon. Every jolt burned, but he stayed awake through sheer will. Ironhoof followed the whole way back to town, refusing every attempt to lead him off. Silas Morn worked through the night, cutting, stitching, digging the bullet free. He shook his head more than he liked. "He'll live," the doctor finally said. "But he won't ride for a while. Might never be the same." Voss looked at Gideon, pale and still on the bed. "None of us are," he said. At dawn, Gideon woke to the sound of hooves outside his window. Ironhoof stood there, alive, steady, waiting. For the first time since the basin, Gideon let himself rest. But rest was never the ending. It was only the quiet before reckoning reached town. Word spread before Gideon could stand on his own. By midday, people gathered outside the sheriff's office, not cheering, not shouting, just standing, waiting, watching the windows as if they expected the past to walk out, wounded and breathing. Voss spoke to them plain. 8 men rode in, none rode out. The gold was returned. The families tied to that bounty would sleep knowing it was finished. No speeches, no praise, just facts. Some nodded, some crossed themselves. A few turned away, uneasy with the cost of order. Inside, Gideon listened in silence. Ironhoof's reins lay looped over a chair beside the bed. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, finished in a way that had nothing to do with bullets. Voss came in alone. "They'll talk," he said. "They always do." Gideon nodded. "Let them. They're asking who you are." Gideon exhaled slowly. "Doesn't matter anymore." Voss hesitated. The Iron Path warden sent a wire. Old records, old name. Gideon closed his eyes. The name he'd buried stayed buried. "I'm done," he said. "That's all they need." That evening, Ironhoof was led into the street, bandages clean, steps careful but proud. The town watched in silence as Gideon, now leaning on a cane, stood beside him. A boy stepped forward. Finn Calder looked up and asked softly, "Why'd you do it?" Gideon looked down at Ironhoof, then back at the boy. "Because some things don't belong to men who take," he said. "And some lines don't fade just because you're old." The boy nodded, like he understood more than words. At sunset, Gideon saddled Ironhoof himself. Slow, deliberate, final. Voss stood nearby. "You leaving?" the sheriff asked. Gideon swung up with effort, pain clear in his face. "Yes," he said. before the stories catch up. He looked once more at the town, then down at Ironhoof. When it was time to go home, they rode west into the dying light. No one tried to stop them. They were found 3 days later. Not the bodies, the tracks. 8 graves beneath a lone mesquite, marked with stones instead of names. The desert had already begun its work. Wind smoothed the sand. Sun erased the violence. No marker told who put them there. None was needed. Voss stood in silence, hat in hand. "So that's it," he murmured. "Justice without witnesses." Far west, Gideon rode slow. Ironhoof's steps grew steadier with each mile, as if the land itself had stitched him whole again. They didn't speak. They never needed to. At dusk, they reached a low ridge overlooking endless sand. Gideon dismounted carefully, joints protesting, breath thin. He rested a hand on Ironhoof's neck. "You did good," he whispered. "Always did." A memory flashed. Another desert, decades back. Another horse, another man who hadn't been fast enough. He'd buried that regret with a badge he never wore again. This time was different. He built a small fire, cooked what little he had, shared it with Ironhoof, same as always. Gold had never mattered. It was just what men killed for. Respect was rarer. Loyalty rarer still. When the fire burned low, Gideon leaned back against the saddle. Stars stretched overhead. Cold, endless, honest. "Tomorrow," he said softly. "We keep going." Ironhoof lowered his head, breathing slow and calm. At dawn, the sun rose. The fire was cold, the saddle untouched. Gideon sat where he had rested, peaceful, hat tipped low, his hand still curled in Ironhoof's mane. He hadn't died running. He hadn't died begging. He died keeping his promise. Ironhoof stood there a long while before turning west, alone, but not lost. They say Texas feared that old man. The truth was simpler. Texas feared what he stood for, because some men don't grow weak, they just run out of warnings. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal. Disclaimer: all stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.